All right, folks, let's get started on this session. Welcome to our session on medicine and teleology. My name is Tom Hogan, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Scranton, Pennsylvania, a Jesuit institution, if I'm allowed to use that term, here on this Holy Cross campus. I'll be chairing the session. The way we'll operate this is we'll have all the speakers present first, and then we will open it up for questions and comments for any of the speakers. Usual reminder, please silence your cell phones right now. All right, so each speaker will go about 20 minutes, and then we should have ample time for discussion questions at the end. So we'll begin with Dr. Jose Bufill. Let me note, in your program, they deprived Dr. Bufill of one L in his last name, so you might want to add that. And he goes by either Jose or Joe. He tells me his mother calls him Jose, everybody else calls him Joe. He is a physician who has been caring for patients with cancer for 30 years. He currently leads the Burr Oak Foundation at the University of Michigan, exploring what it means to be human. If you haven't already done so, you should go out and check the Burr Oak Foundation website. It's just a fabulous resource and has great photos. Dr. Bufill is a native of Havana, Cuba, earned his medical degree at the University of Navarre in Pamplona, Spain. Internal medicine residency and a fellowship in the medical oncology hematology at the Medical College of Wisconsin affiliated hospitals in Milwaukee. After clinical training, he was a visiting research fellow in the Department of Medical Genetics at the University of Helsinki in Finland. So he's been around a bit. He is a fellow of the American College of Physicians, a member of the American Society of Human Genetics, and is board certified in internal medicine and medical oncology. He currently serves as the director of the Cancer Genetics Program at St. Joseph Regional Medical Center in Mishawaka. He is the author of numerous original papers, oral presentations, and articles primarily in the field of cancer genetics, and some of these have done real groundbreaking work. Dr. Jose Bufill.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It sounded like my mother was introducing me. So, in the interest of time, I'll just get right to it. People usually go to doctors because they suspect that there's something wrong with them. They don't feel well and want to know why, or they feel fine and identify some physical change that raises concern. From the doctor's perspective, the person presents with a set of symptoms and physical signs that need to be interpreted and placed in context. The challenge faced by the physician is to determine for that individual patient what is normal and what is pathological in order to help that person maintain good health, understood broadly as the optimal functioning of their organism. So distinctions of normality and pathology and how these concepts relate to the notion of health are present and actively engaged in the daily practice of medicine. The intuition is that healthy people are those who do not need medical treatment, and unhealthy ones are those who do. Professional academics, mostly philosophers and social scientists, actively debate how to define these concepts. Their discussions seem to center around two concerns. First, whether normal and pathological should be understood only by statistically defined physiological criteria contained within a living organism, or whether these concepts should incorporate the organism's ability to adapt to internal or external stressors over time. This is the closed, open, or static dynamic axis. The second concern is whether values framed in terms of categories of good, better, best should inform these definitions. Some scholars seek to exclude values from their definitions. In a value-laden approach, a sick person may be considered healthy if he or she recovers a certain level of function after suffering an illness, or in the case of persons with chronic illnesses or disabilities, if they are able to adapt successfully to them. This notion of health, understood as resilience or adaptability, was promoted by the late French philosopher-physician Georges Kaldjian from the Sorbonne in his influential book, On the Normal and the Pathological, published in English in 1978. The author encouraged us to pay more attention to how the whole patient interacts with their environment. For Kaldjian, health is not a static concept, but a dynamic continuum, multidimensional and value-rich, that should be distinguished from function alone. Most of the peer-reviewed reflections I came across from academic philosophers on the categories of normal and pathological in medicine were tightly reasoned, well-argued, logical thinking, written mostly for other philosophers. I suspect that most practicing physicians might find these distinctions interesting, but impractical. We might adopt the attitude of Justice Potter Stewart in the Supreme Court's landmark 1964 ruling on obscenity. Normal, pathological, I know it when I see it. In general terms, the word normal always refers to or points to a related norm. A norm is an authoritative universal standard which serves to define the normal for a particular individual. The norm for blood sugar or glucose is 60 to 110 for the general population of human beings. Mrs. Smith's blood sugar is normal when it falls within that range. A norm defines the ideal functional parameters for an organism. It's good or desirable if the blood sugar is between 60 and 110. It's not so good and maybe undesirable if the blood sugar is outside, above, or below that range. Insofar as it describes the desirable ideal to be maintained, a norm is prescriptive. It offers reasons to take action. Give sugar when the blood sugar is too low. Give insulin when the blood sugar is too high. Normal or abnormal, on the other hand, are simply descriptive. They express the result obtained for a particular individual. We can say that normal, abnormal is what is for me or for her. A norm is what ought to be for the optimal functioning of the organism. We arrive at biological norms by measuring a particular parameter in large numbers of individuals and applying statistical methods to arrive at what ought to be. In medicine, as in other sciences, normal is often expressed by means of the normal distribution curve, the famous bell curve. The most common values in the center and less common, more extreme values to either side. Values are compared among individuals and a desirable ideal is defined. The general understanding of normal as what is the most frequent result defines the other of the two dominant academic philosophical approaches to normal and pathological that I referred to previously. I'll call this approach the static model of normality. Normal in this model is where most values fall. Normal is average, and perfect health would imply that the individual is perfectly average. By collecting data, defining norms, and comparing results of individuals with those norms, we arrive at a concept of normal and pathological. This approach, the static approach, is promoted by Christopher Boers, currently professor of philosophy at the University of Delaware. As you can imagine, there are other scholars with opinions who fall somewhere else within the quadrants I showed before. According to Professor Boers, an organism is healthy if and only if it is functioning in a manner that is either at or above the statistically normal level of functioning for entities of that type. An organism is diseased if it is functioning at a level below their statistical normal. Boers contends that statistics provide a value-free way of differentiating between healthy body states and diseased body states. Without these hard distinctions, health and disease could be anything at all. This reliance on the language of mathematics to define health and disease is rooted in the early modern scientific revolution. Galileo was among the first to express confidence in numbers in a systematic mathematical interpretation of the world in his work Il Saggiatore, the Assayer. Quote, philosophy, understood as science, is written in this grand book, I mean the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. If mathematics is the hermeneutical key to health, then normal and pathological could be defined by a law of averages. In this model, perfect health would be to be perfectly average. An unintended test of this notion of health was offered by Dr. Lior Pachter of Caltech, who in 2014 conducted a thought experiment in response to overtly eugenicist public comments made by Nobel laureate James Watson. In response to Watson, Professor Pachter asked, if perfection is possible, then who is the perfect human? To answer the question, Dr. Pachter first constructed a hypothetical, statistically perfect human. He did this using a large database of genetic information from SNPedia, a resource which allowed him to select for all human genes which were both highly relevant to human physiology and had well-defined good and bad versions, normal and pathological versions. Once he had assembled the theoretically perfect genome, he then matched that sequence information to a library of fully sequenced genomes from real human beings, collected through the 1,000 Genomes Project of the National Human Genome Research Institute. As it happened, the real individual who most closely matched the hypothetically perfect human genome was not a white Anglo-Saxon university professor, but rather sample HG00737, a Puerto Rican woman, not J-Lo specifically, but given her ancestry, intelligence, and physical features, she could certainly be of the type identified by Professor Pachter. Notwithstanding the methodological foibles of this thought experiment, advances in genetics do allow us to reflect on the normal, the pathological, and the perfect in perhaps a new way. Genes, after all, are the nuts and bolts of human physiology and the interface between our bodies and the environment. Just as Galileo expressed confidence in the power of mathematics 400 years ago, scientists today proclaim genetics as the hermeneutical key to a long and healthy life and a means to human enhancement. So what does the new language of genetics reveal to us? To summarize, genetics reveals three basic facts. We are all related, we are all different, and we are all sick. We are all closely related. Genomic science indicates that humans are a genetically homogeneous species. There are no subspecies of humans. Genetic methods do not support the classification of humans into discrete races. We seem to have a shared African ancestry from a single common mother. Our genomes are 99.9% identical with one another, and yet we are all uniquely different. If you run a spell check on the letters of the genetic sequences of different individual humans, there are always differences. No two genomes, including those of identical twins, are ever exactly the same. The wide range of differences between individual humans are explained at the molecular level by random variations or mutations in 1 out of every 1,000 letters of our DNA. They allow us to determine paternity or to prove guilt or exonerate in criminal investigations. Those variations also seem to explain the possibility of human adaptation to evolutionary pressures. Finally, we are all sick. While many of those variations that identify and distinguish human individuals are functionally neutral, some predispose us to illness, and a few are overtly pathogenic, very likely to make us sick. But the fact is that there are no perfect human genetic specimens. Every human individual harbors abnormal, disease-inducing mutations. We are all sick in our own unique way. So the revelations of genetics do not contradict and seem to provide evidence in support of some basic tenets of Christian revelation. We are all one family, at least children of a common mother. Each one of us is demonstrably a unique and unrepeatable being. And finally, mortality, disease, and death is built into our DNA. In a sense, it's normal to be pathological. If it's normal to be pathological, how are we to consider human perfection? Today, the word perfect probably elicits a sense of excellence, of being the best, of flawlessness or absence of defects. These terms imply the comparison of a being with an ideal standard. The etymology of the Latin word perfectus, however, has its roots in the Greek teleioites, which means completion or fulfillment. Aristotle distinguishes three senses of perfection. That is perfect, which is complete, which contains all the requisite parts, which is so good that nothing of the kind could be better, which that is perfect, which has attained its purpose. So that is perfect, which is complete. From conception, every human being contains all the requisite parts. All the genes required for the life and growth of a unique individual member of the human species are present at conception. And all subsequent development is driven by the coordinated activation and inactivation of the genetic complement within that new human being. For the rest of that being's existence, only food, water, and shelter are needed for that entity to grow and develop. Nothing of the kind could be better. Here, we might connect perfection, understood as completeness, with the notion of originality. An original is one of a kind, something new, the first of its kind. Science says this. Each human being is an original, because the genetic sequence that distinguishes you from me and from everyone else has never existed before and will never exist again. Each human being is a new and fresh creative event. Because each human being is an original, nothing could be better than him or her. Comparison is neither helpful nor necessary. In a sense, an original may be deemed perfect in itself without the need for comparison to other things. Finally, that is perfect which has attained its purpose. Viewed through the lens of genetics, our physical bodies are in fact finished from the moment of conception. We can know the color of our eyes, the physical disorders to which we are prone, and diseases which we are likely to experience. Every detail of our physiology is identifiable at conception. This fact is the basis for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis of human embryos offered by some scientists today. Given the flaws embedded in our DNA from the beginning, we might say that the purpose of our physical bodies is to begin and to guide our spiritual perfection by the experience of illness and limitation. Dependence, vulnerability, and weakness are present at the starting point of human existence, embedded in our genomes from the start. They ought not to be flaws or imperfections to be feared and eliminated, but a revelation of our most authentic, our truest self. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the title of my talk today is The Right to Health and Our Role in Realizing It. So just by way of outline, first I'm going to be looking at the right to health as defined in international law. So I'm going to be looking at the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So this is a treaty that states sign on to and then are legally bound by the obligations under the treaty. Then I'll be moving on to provide a definition of health because it's key to understanding what the right to health actually requires. And then I'll be offering the kind of main dominant alternative definition of health and the right to health today, which is provided by the World Health Organization. I'll then critique this definition and focus in on one aspect of the critique, namely that the World Health Organization's definition ignores the fact that individuals and communities are usually the main protagonists of maintaining and improving their own health. And the purpose of setting out the treaty law at the beginning is to just draw a distinction between what the law actually requires and what the state's obligations are and what the WHO advocates for. The right to health. So Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights sets out a roadmap for states. So it says the state parties to this covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So and then it sets out certain steps for the state parties to take to fully realize this. And it's important to recognize in this definition that it is limited. So each of the steps set out, so firstly the reduction of infant mortality, the improvement of hygiene, the prevention of disease, are limited kind of based on what the state is actually providing at the present time. So the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has commented on this article, and this isn't a legally binding interpretation, but it's helpful for our analysis. So they state that the notion of the highest attainable standard of health takes into account both the individual's biological and socioeconomic preconditions and the state's available resources. And then they acknowledge that there's a number of aspects which can't be addressed solely within the relationship between the state and individuals. So in particular, good health cannot be ensured by the state, nor can states provide protection against every possible cause of human ill health. Thus, genetic factors, individual susceptibility to ill health, and the adoption of unhealthy or risky lifestyles may play an important role with respect to an individual's health. Consequently, the right to health must be understood as the right to the enjoyment of a variety of facilities, goods, services, and conditions necessary to realize, again, that wording of the highest attainable standard of health. So there are certain factors under Article 12 that are a good starting point to examine what's actually meant by the highest attainable standard in each specific region and state. So first, availability. So are there functioning public health systems, health facilities, goods and services actually in a state to begin with? Accessibility, are these accessible? Are they physically accessible, economically accessible? Next, acceptable. So are they acceptable? What's the standard of health that's provided? And what's the standard of the goods and services that are provided as well? So each of these factors reflects what I think is a correct understanding of the importance of the existing landscape, both legal and cultural, in each state where the requirements of the right to health are realized. So each of these factors should be considered when asking, what obligations does the state actually have? Has the state fulfilled these obligations? Why or why not? So the next point is, within this definition given under the International Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we need an actual definition of health. If we don't have this, then the nation state could deploy a right to health to justify harming the health of individuals or groups. So in order to do this, I'm proposing a definition that health is linked to the human body, is not solely a subjective determination. It's intimately connected to healing and wholeness and can be defined as a good in itself and not merely the absence of disease or sickness. So health within this conception is defined as the well-working of the human organism as a whole. So the question of whether a human organism is well-working or not can be answered by a physician. And this is because the pursuit of health has been defined as the proper purpose of the medical profession. And so this definition is the one that's put forward by Leon Cass and Edmund Pellegrino. So I want to contrast the definition that was in the treaty to the definition put forward by the World Health Organization. And this definition is dominant in mainstream culture, and also in the jurisprudence of some of the regional human rights courts. It's also been influential in national conceptions of the right to health. So the WHO Constitution defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And so it says that the right to health is the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. So as you can see, this is a much wider definition. I call this the maximalist definition of health and the right to health. So why is it problematic? So I'm going to go through just a few points before I go to kind of the main point of the talk, which is that it ignores kind of the individual and our own agency in realizing and maintaining our health. So the first point is that there's an overemphasis on subjective well-being. And again, this is just in the context of defining a right to health. So I think that some of the points that are made in the WHO Constitution can be seen as aspirational or under like a broad conception of what health could be. But when it becomes the subject of a legal right, I'm arguing that it needs to be more limited. So firstly, if health is defined solely as subjective well-being, any action could be justified as contributing towards your own subjective well-being. So each person under this definition would be justified to have the right to make choices that would allow her to attain and develop all such capacities fully without any constraints. Correspondingly, others would have a negative duty not to impose any constraints on these choices, while at the same time having the positive duty to assist the person in attaining their own complete state of well-being. So the second point is the emphasis on complete well-being is problematic because under this idea, harm to health is brought into any omission that produces subjective suffering or stress or anxiety. And again, this is an unrealistic burden for states and for private actors and is conceptually problematic when it becomes the subject of a right. The next point, healthcare is social. So this definition ignores the rights and the obligations of the providers of healthcare, which may limit the determination of subjective well-being. The next point is that it ignores legitimate pluralism in the realm of health. So this definition would seek to homogenize decisions about the identification and differentiation of health risks at an international level, which I argue should be made by the specific communities who are actually faced with the health risk at hand. So these determinations should not be made solely by an institution which is external and takes a monolithic top-down approach to solving problems, but rather decisions of risk appropriation and identification are better placed internally, that is, determined by the communities that are affected by them and that are closer to the ground. And finally, this maximalist definition put forward by the WHO is not what I call an embodied decision, an embodied definition, because it could justify and actually require certain actions to be taken that would harm the well-working of the individual as a whole in favor of subjective mental well-being. So the kind of main critique I have of the WHO definition is that it ignores the individual. So the maintenance and improvement of health depends on a variety of factors, most prominently the individual person seeking to maintain or improve their own health. In the words of Cass, to make my health someone else's duty is not only unfair, but it is to impose a duty impossible to fulfill. Each person is a main protagonist in ensuring that they become or remain healthy. Certain people do not value their health as much as others. As Cass notes, the age and external circumstances of a particular person show the relative of the importance of health and unhealth. Some people may completely ignore or overlook certain absences of health, while others can be overcome by a change of their external environment. So a broad and over-inclusive right to health ignores this and gives individuals a claim right that is a legal claim against anyone and everyone who takes an action that affects their own health, while allowing them to avoid reciprocal duties to improve their own health. If we leave, so a connected point is related to autonomy, our own autonomy. So if we leave the furthering of all aspects of health to the state, we're bound to fail in improving and maintaining human health unless we usurp the legitimate autonomy of individuals and communities to make their own decisions. So the point here is that there are certain spheres of life that we don't want the state to reach into. We want to retain our agency and our ability to make certain choices that affect our own health outcomes for good or for bad. So one scholar uses the example of kidney transplants and points out that while kidneys are scarce and transplants have the ability to dramatically improve the health of certain persons, we don't want to be forced to donate a kidney because of another person's legal rights. Rather, the state should have a role in encouraging us to consider kidney donation because it seems more natural to suppose there's a human right of non-participation in this case, rather than a human right to health that forces us to do something that we don't want to do. So in conclusion, in considering what health means in the human rights context, it's important to distinguish health from other things. So it's different from pleasure, happiness, civil peace, and order, virtue, wisdom, and truth. And it can only be realized, fully realized in mortal human beings. Health is also transient and not permanent. Therefore, we must acknowledge these limiting factors, and we must seek health knowing and accepting, as much as we're able to, that the transience of health and of beings who are healthy. And this should inform the way that we define what health is and what the legal right to health should be. So there's a distinction between the most comprehensive vision of any human interest, such as health, and the portion of that interest that is chosen to become the subject of rules of law in order to defend it as a fundamental human right at the universal level. It's never the case with any human right that the entirety of the human interest that justifies the right is actually contained in the right. This is equally true in the realm of health. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today. And as I was thinking about the first three presentations earlier this morning in this room, from Mark and Xavier and Andrew, and then from Jose and Maryssa, I see what I'm doing now as an act of recapitulation. For those of you who enjoy music in the sonata form, you'll appreciate that all the more. And I'm indebted to that. And so there's nothing wrong with a certain amount of repetition in life, assuming that repetition is of good things. And I certainly am indebted to those who provided the first round of that goodness, and we'll see what you think about the last round here. According to ancient traditions of thought, wisdom is a matter of conforming ourselves to reality, of allowing what is real in this world to impress itself upon us, so that our ideas, desires, choices, and actions reflect and respond well to that reality. On this account, the reality outside ourselves, God in his created world, is meant to fashion, guide, and regulate the internal experience of our perceptions and our feelings. As you are aware, there is a current alternative to this ancient approach that moves in the opposite direction. It starts from the inside of our desires and then moves outward in attempts to fulfill those desires by imposing our intentions on the created world, the world of things, circumstances, relationships, and even our bodies. Those of you who know the work of Joseph Pieper on the virtue of prudence, he speaks beautifully to this idea of the imposition of the will on that which we desire. Nietzsche would be an extreme proponent of this driving sense of appetite, the self-determined imposition of the human will to power. But much more commonly today, we see the less intense but no less significant manifestations of this will to impose through what has come to be known as expressive individualism. In medicine, the ethos of expressive individualism increasingly encourages the application of medical technologies that allow people to enact their desires by imposing their wills on the biological reality of their bodies and the psychological reality of their minds. Though there is, thankfully, plenty of traditional medical practice left in the world today, medical technology is increasingly being used as a flexible means to self-constructed ends. As a result, medical technologies are being used to denature a bodily, biological reality that heretofore has been part of the givenness of human life, the embodiment of human life, which for so long has been the basis for defining human health, both scientifically and by common sense. The Bible proclaims the givenness of our bodies as part of God's work of creation, in response to which we are called to receive the goodness of life as a gift and promote the goodness of health as a responsibility. From the Christian perspective, wisdom in medicine is to be pursued by conforming to the goodness of God's creation, by attending to the endowed value of our embodied selves as God's creatures, male and female, body and soul, made in his image. On this view, health is a wholeness, a mysterious and yet perceivable integration that has biopsychosocial spiritual dimensions. Within this integration, we are called to harmonize our souls with the ordered goodness of God's creation as expressed in our bodies. This harmonizing represents our flourishing, and it entails restraint. For when the disordered desires of our misguided hearts run contrary to the God-given design of our bodies, those desires need to be controlled rather than enabled by technologies that would be used to manipulate or disfigure. And this biblical proclamation regarding our embodied existence is found to be very clear. We are created good, very good. Our very goodness was confirmed in Christ's incarnation and is confirmed by his redeeming work that makes our bodies the temples of the Holy Spirit. And this very goodness will be confirmed ultimately in our resurrection with Christ, when, as the Apostle Paul says, our lowly bodies will be like his glorious body. Of course, none of this very goodness denies the effects of sin in our earthly bodies. These are the effects that Paul recognizes when he speaks of the groaning of creation and the groaning of our bodies, a groaning that will not be relieved until the full redemption of our bodies is revealed, when in the new Jerusalem there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. So although we will most certainly groan in this world, as Christians we believe our bodies are still emphatically good. And this goodness of our existence as creatures also reminds us of the goodness of our Creator, of our gracious Heavenly Father, who providentially cares for both our bodies and our souls, and calls us to loving obedience as responsible stewards of the gift of embodied life. As stewards, we are beneficiaries who are called to be recipients of a gift that is to be received, protected, and promoted. And we are to resist the temptation to become manipulators who treat the body as an object to be controlled, modified, or remade. Remy Bragg describes this difference between grateful stewardship and independent action as arising from two contrasting views of the world. One view perceives the world as nature and nature as a human project. The other view perceives the world as creation and creation as a providentially guided blessing to be received in humble dependence on the God who gives it. As Bragg puts it, the contrast is between God's providence and man's project. And those two poles, he argues, define the difference between the pre-modern and the modern outlook on the world. Curing Mad Truths is a tremendous book if you haven't read it yet, by Remy Bragg. Blind nature versus providential creation. What a stunning contrast of worldviews, packed with equally contrasting understandings of how we as humans understand our meaning, purpose, and identity, and how these understandings determine our concepts of health. So I'm about to get into the concepts of health part of this, and I'll just say, I'll give you my hand version of a PowerPoint slide that I use routinely in my teaching of medical students and others. Sort of 4 sequential, sort of intentional, sort of blocks that point this way, from tests and treatments, to goals of care, to concepts of health, to visions of human flourishing, right? That's the intent, the sort of, you call it the intentional landscape of what we're doing as physicians and other healthcare professionals when we do anything. It's to a purpose, it's to an end, okay? Regarding different concepts of health, it's my impression from the literature on the philosophy of health that, at least from my sort of 30,000-foot view interpretation, and I realize some of you in this room will know much about this area, much more about this area of philosophy than I do, but I would say that there are 2 major kinds of views, or perhaps 3. on how health should be conceived. And I actually think these are profoundly relevant to certainly the environments I inhabit in the health professions. So the first is a so-called biostatistical concept of health. The second, you could label it a well-being concept of health. You hear all the recapitulation again with what's gone before. And then the third would be some combination of the two. So someone like Dr. Edmund Pellegrino very much would endorse that sort of a hybrid, the combination of the two. And that would be my own view as well. But first, now the biostatistical concept. This is the concept that I and so many other medical students learned in medical school, right? By studying biology, physiology, anatomy, histology, pathology, pharmacology, microbiology, and all those ologies, right? A biostatistical concept is seen as naturalist, for it arises from nature, not our minds, and is therefore objective, observable, and value-free. On this account, a patient is viewed as a describable object, and disease is defined in biological and statistical terms as a deviation from normal. A biostatistical concept, I believe, resonates deeply with the Christian understanding that our existence as embodied beings is objectively based in our creation by God in His image, male and female, giving us a biological nature, full of flesh and blood and bones, which mysteriously serves as the substrate of our minds and our souls. On this understanding, disease is objectively discoverable and health is internal to the givenness of the body, rather than an idea of being imposed from the outside by the constructs of an individual or a society. And on this biostatistical view, the sexual dimorphism of male and female is taken as normal, healthy, and definitive. A dimorphism that is biologically grounded in differences of genotype, phenotype, glands, and structures that facilitate procreation, and hormones. By contrast to a biostatistical concept of health, there is what can be referred to as a well-being concept. On this account, the patient is not an object, but rather a subject, whose flourishing depends on the feelings, experiences, and choices of the patient, or on values determined by society. This well-being concept is considered normativist, value-laden, and individually or socially constructed. It is a subjective account of health because it is predicated on the beliefs, values, desires of the subject. And it prioritizes, and this is a key point, it prioritizes a person's ability to realize his or her particular goals. Medicine then becomes a means of enabling persons to pursue what matters most to them. On this account, individual preferences dictate the goals of healthcare, and these goals are allowed to expand beyond the traditional goals of medicine, such as curing disease, restoring function, prolonging life, and providing comfort, to new possibilities, such as enhancement, to exaggerate or exceed normal capacities, or modification, such as in the case of so-called gender-affirming care, in which biologically normal hormones, tissues, and structures are manipulated, removed, or changed. It's a very interesting question, I think, to ask how these two concepts of health interact in actual medical practice, because I believe they do in one proportion or another. It won't surprise you to know that I, along with plenty of other physicians, agree with the biostatistical concept of health, but you might wonder what there may be in the well-being concept of health that is also appreciated by large numbers of physicians, and rightly so. For within the well-being concept is an admirable and necessary concern for the subjective welfare and individual freedom of patients as persons. Persons whose dignity includes a responsibility to deliberate and choose wisely when it comes to decisions about different possible goals of care in medicine and different possible medical means to achieve those goals. When such means and goals are ethically legitimate, respect for persons, not to mention love of neighbor, reminds us that patients should be expected to exercise moral agency through a process of decision-making that they share with healthcare professionals. So on the one hand, clinicians need to rely on a biostatistical concept of health to assess the problems patients bring forward to determine whether these problems should be treated as medical problems. This biostatistical assessment allows the clinician to stay oriented to the goodness of the body. And this is the objective part of the mutual accommodation that needs to occur between patients and clinicians when they work together in the pursuit of health. But on the other hand, it's also important to acknowledge that shared judgments and decisions about health and disease also depend on the patient's beliefs about health and the patient's assessment of how medical interventions will affect his or her own well-being. So we're going to think about all sorts of examples, but whether it's sort of straightforward treatment of high cholesterol with a statin medication or different approaches to the treatment of prostate cancer, until a patient buys into how this is going to benefit their well-being, it's a non-starter. The physician can recommend all sorts of things and try to persuade, but there has to be that mutual sort of agreement and accommodation. So decisions about healthcare need to be shared between patients and clinicians, and this means that shared decisions will depend on a mutual understanding that rests both on the objectivity of biostatistical health and the subjectivity of a particular patient's sense of well-being. Thankfully, most of the time clinicians who are guided by a biostatistical concept of health are able to respect and follow the legitimate goals of care which patients value. However, when clinicians encounter patients whose concepts of health are driven by desires and result in goals that come at the expense of bodily or psychological integrity, disagreements may become serious and even insurmountable. In Western society, there are increasing examples of such conflicts in healthcare, from abortion-assisted suicide to so-called harm reduction strategies for opioid addiction, such as safe injection sites and safe drug supply programs, or gender-affirming care, which employs pronouns, puberty blockers, cross hormones, and surgery to endorse an ideology of gender that denies the biological basis of our identities as men and women. These three examples show how a well-being concept of health can be used to endorse an approach to medical practice that prioritizes the patient's subjective sense of well-being by allowing patients to pursue medical treatments that enable them to achieve their self-determined goals, even when doing so comes at the expense of biostatistical objectivity and disregards the created goodness of their lives, or their minds, or their bodies. It seems fair to say that well-being concepts of health in our society and in the health professions are increasingly being misapplied in ways that are both harmful and distorting. This is being driven by ideologies that do not accept the inherent value of the gift of life or the endowed goodness of embodied life. So it comes as no surprise that deep moral conflicts in healthcare are becoming more common. These conflicts pose serious challenges for healthcare professionals who are constrained by conscience to practice a medicine that conforms to the goodness of the body and respects the value of human life from conception to natural death. These are challenges faced by professionals who want to preserve and promote what has been made good, very good. I have many conversations with medical students about this because they're making decisions about going forward that sadly have to take into consideration where things are even more challenging rather than less, but they're increasingly, the prevalence of challenge, shall we say, is spreading. So how do we meet such challenges? In many ways, but for now let me end by naming just two. At the level of the individual healthcare professional, we meet the challenge of conflict through conscientious practice, by exercising our moral agency as health professionals in the pursuit of what is good and the avoidance of what is evil. This includes resisting many pressures to be complicit in practices that deny the inherent goodness and givingness of embodied life. For the Christian, conscientious practice is a way of referring to Christ's calling to be salt and light in this world, to preserve and to illuminate. At the level of society, these deep conflicts call for a politics of multiple communities. I got that phrase from Nicholas Wolterstorff. So that the political implications of moral pluralism are reflected in genuine tolerance of deep differences. Catholic healthcare institutions in this country demonstrate what a Christian contribution in a pluralistic culture can look like, and how the ethical and religious directives of Catholic healthcare provide for a truly countercultural practice of medicine, one that preserves and illuminates by acknowledging the providential care and sovereignty of God, by attending to the inherent goodness of our embodied souls, and by respecting and loving all those who are sick, no matter how afflicted, weakened, or old. This is the kind of witness our world needs, a witness that reflects our need to perceive clearly, reason carefully, speak honestly, and act with courage and love in the confidence that what God has made, and made very good, needs to be respected, cultivated, and cared for. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaldjian. We have ample time for questions, comments. You can, what we'd like to do now is I'll call on people. I know at this conference, the custom seems to be to identify yourself and your institutional affiliation. We're not going to impose that. If you would like to remain anonymous when you ask your question, that's perfectly all right. But do tell us if you're directing the question to one of the panelists, one of the speakers, or just to humanity in general, and we'll go from there. So let's start back there. Mike.
I'm Leah Sargent. I write Other Feminisms. I'd love to hear from Dr. Kaldjian or any of the panelists about what they think lay education in medicine should look like. Because listening to your talk, Dr. Kaldjian, I was really thinking about the duty to have a well-formed conscience, and similarly, a well-formed sense of well-being in the body. But I don't hear as much discussion about education in that sense of one's own body.
I couldn't agree more with where you're going with that. And in fact, I was just talking to Andrew, who spoke already this morning, about the need for the church writ large, in this sense, to be blessed by a deeper biblical traditional understanding of what health is supposed to look like. So I'd be happy to talk more with you after, but yes, I agree. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think there is a growing movement in medicine to engage the participation of patients. I think where we see this most obviously is in the case of rare diseases, where you have collaborations between affected families and basic researchers and clinicians that are working together. So I think this idea of a collaborative engagement toward health is definitely something toward which medicine is moving.
Did you want to come? And I guess I would also just add to that, if I might, that actually in a lot of the work that I do within Christian medical ethics with colleagues, we often discuss how affected all of us are by the thickness of the cultural realms we inhabit, right? So we've really absorbed cultural understandings that, quite frankly, are in profound tension with a Christian understanding. So thanks again.
Okay, and we're up here now.
So a question for Lauris. Mark Cherry from Texas. Do you think that the subjective well-being concepts of health and disease become inevitable once the culture refuses to reject God, or refuses to accept God, or any fully objective account of the truth?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Maybe it's a parallel to that famous line from Dostoevsky and the Brothers Karamazov, when isn't Ivan says, when God is not, one doesn't believe in God's existence, all is permitted. So now I think that, and then we get that Nietzschean impulse that says it's all within, it's all for me. So I agree, but having said that, I mean, the Catholic tradition has its way of understanding this, certainly through natural law. From my own Christian tradition, common grace, we can be grateful to the extent that the goodness that God has made still remains intact within the human conscience, more or less depending upon the given situation. And so I think, in fact, that Pellegrino, when I talked to him about these things some years ago, I remember his you could call it optimism, but I think it's better as a Christian to call it hopefulness, that when we're speaking with people who see the world differently than we do, we can still look forward to points of contact and anticipate their presence, even if it turns out they don't seem to be present in actual fact. But I think you're certainly right about the diagnosis, and I think it leaves us with a question of how do we go forward, and I think we should always work toward the possibility of a shared understanding. Thank you.
Maryssa or Joe, anything to add to that?
I'll just add one point. I think speaking from establishing a legal framework, I think you could have a situation where you don't have the subjective well-being concept of health that's legally operationalized. So if you look at the wording of the original treaty on economic, social, and cultural rights, it doesn't advocate for that. So I think you could have, a legal system that directly tacks onto that and doesn't fully endorse the well-being conception of health.
Okay, gentleman in the back.
Santiago Legarre, Universidad Católica Argentina. Thank you for a wonderful panel. The question is for Dr. Gabriel, and if he cares to comment, for Dr. Bufill. I was wondering whether your rejection of a subjective notion of health as I understood it and you're proposing an objective one is in line or rather in tension with Dr. Bufill's, where, as far as I understood again, it wasn't very clear to me what it is to be healthy or perfect, and I think that's the point of his presentation.
That's a good question. Thank you for that. I think if we have the definition of health as the well-working of the human organism as a whole, I would add in as determined by a physician. So I think that a good physician would be able to, like Dr. Kaldjian spoke about, consider also the subjective well-being of the patient. So I guess my definition isn't completely moving out of the subjective well-being. It's just saying that shouldn't be the totality of the concept that makes up the right. I think it should still be considered, but one step removed by the healthcare provider of the physician, as opposed to solely the patient kind of engaging with the state at that level, if that makes sense.
I sort of presented the two poles of conceptualizations of health and disease, one being the biostatistical and the other being sort of a more holistic. I think the World Health Organization is sort of sided toward the more holistic approach in their definition of health. I think from my perspective, it's kind of like if the patient seems to be doing well and they're compensated, and it's really, I mean, these abstract definitions are a little bit, from my point of view, a little impractical, but I guess policies are based on these definitions, and so I'm not sure what else to say.
Okay. Back here.
Jonathan Bailey from Arkansas. Questions generally for the audience and maybe for Ms. Gabriel. We're seeing some gender-affirming clinics like the Tavistock Clinic in the UK retract the things that they're doing, many lawsuits against providers for causing bodily harm to people who went through so-called gender-affirming care. I wonder if you can comment on what a movement might look like in light of those lawsuits, or even within those medical bodies, to get back to more of an objective and less subjective, delusional-based standard of care.
It's a good question. I think probably the doctors on the panel would be able to answer it a bit better. But just from the legal perspective, I guess a piece of it would be focusing on the conscience rights of providers as a start. Also looking at the outcomes for patients and seeing, how they fared. Like you said, a lot of these clinics are rolling back on their practices. And there are robust protections around the world for malpractice, for harm done by physicians. So I guess employing those legal tools that are already existing could also help. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I mean, it's a profoundly important question, and there are plenty of physicians that I know who care deeply about it, and I think basically along the lines of what you're saying is there needs to be a commitment to and a demonstration of a better and different way, and that's going to come at a certain cost, right? Because there are profound forces and pressures to comply and be complicit. And even at the legal front, I'm familiar with some conversations about different jurisdictions have different degrees of protection for so-called medical conscience. And I think medical students and nursing students, PA students, they need to be aware that there are individuals who think the same way they do, and that there is a path forward into the professions, and state legislators need to be aware of this too, that even people considering a career in the health professions need to know that there is sort of, shall we say, a traditional approach to healthcare that's not only legitimate, but it's the very anchor that we've all been relying upon and blessed by in the history of medicine up until this point in time.
Xavier Simmons. I work for a place called the Human Flourishing Program, and some of the research we do looks at how the resources and methodologies of public health can be used to think about broader questions of human flourishing. And I think it actually is relevant to a lot of what the panelists have discussed, because I think that our work is underpinned by an assumption that health can be understood in a very broad way, that's perhaps not entirely coextensive with well-being as such, but you're getting a bit closer to that than maybe some of these more limited definitions of health that have been mentioned in the presentations. So, for example, like looking at forgiveness as a public health problem, that might be one example of how we conceive of health in a broader way. So, I was wondering what the panelists think about that approach, because I suppose there's a negative form of medicalization that can occur in society, but then perhaps there's also a positive form which helps us to see the broader human phenomena that confront clinicians when they're trying to adequately treat patients and deal with as well public health problems.
Yeah, I think sort of definitions of concepts like health are always, I don't think there's sort of one definition that would encompass all the dimensions, and maybe the two poles are helpful insofar as they contrast different realities. And so it's almost like they're good in order to sort of engage or incite or begin a conversation about realities of human existence and human life that are difficult sort of to define. Whenever you define something, you're sort of there's a certain limitation that is involved in any definition. And so, and again, a concept like health is so broad and so multi-dimensional that it's hard to sort of give a comprehensive definition. So I think definitions in this sense are helpful in the sense of, to begin a conversation and sort of tease out what the real issues are.
It's a very important question. Thank you, Xavier, for raising it, because true to what many of us care about in medicine is that treatments and tests would, lead to the promotion of goals of care and health as understood by whomever is involved, and then a vision of flourishing. When one thinks about the biopsychosocial, spiritual, so-called model of health, it's an interesting just sort of test question. To what extent is the physician or the nurse expert in the bio, the psycho, the socio, the spiritual? So hence that keyword medicalization. If you want to snoop around on the web, if you're not introduced to this sociological idea of what gets sort of taken in by medicine and gets sort of now harnessed for who knows what other social ends, et cetera, is really important. So my way of teaching about this to medical students is to suggest we need to be aware of and sensitive to and help coordinate the care of these other dimensions, but not presume to be expert in it, because therein lies a tremendous risk of arrogance.
My name's Andrew, and I'm with the Boundaries of Humanity Project. And sure, Dr. Gabriel, my question for you was within your framework, and possibly you could comment on what do you think Leon Cass might have said or might say on this, was what do you think the state's role should be then in restricting recreational drug use within this framework of health, especially since it pours into families and communities and kind of ripples out beyond the individual?
That's a very good question, Andrew. I don't know if I will comment on what I think Leon Cass would say, but I think that there is probably some openness from the treaty language on how a state could deal with the problem of drug use. I think it would be open for them to criminalize use and also to encourage different programs around addiction recovery. But I think the great thing about the language of the Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is that it provides space for states to determine what their local communities need. So one of the factors listed was to try to reduce infant mortality, for example. So if a state saw that, okay, there are a lot of pregnant women who are using drugs, it's increasing infant mortality, they could say, okay, this is the solution. One of the ways, to implement them would to be criminalizing drug use. Other ways would be encouraging social programs to dissuade people from using or to, help addicts who want to recover. So I think that it would be up to the states to decide how to tackle that problem. Under the WHO's vision, I think that there would probably be less space to criminalize or to dissuade people from using drugs if that was part of their subjective well-being, if that's how they experienced it.
Okay, we have reached the witching hour. We're going to conclude this. Before we do conclude it, could we have a round of applause for our tech guy? How about the tech guy back there, huh? Yeah. And then another one for our panelists.